Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian, and today we're taking a look at large frame 1896 Bergmann automatic pistols. Now in the last video we looked at the small frame 1896 Bergmann. Those were made in a 5mm extremely small proprietary cartridge. These, the large frame version of the 1896, were made in two different cartridges, also both proprietary, a 6.5mm and also an 8mm. Now, the reason for these is Bergman was looking for military contracts as well as civilian purchase. So they made the small version for like the pocket carry, the 1890s equivalent of a CCW, and they made larger pistols both for people who wanted something a little bit bigger, a full-size pistol for target shooting, but they were also hoping to get military contracts for these. Now between the two, the 8mm is by far the scarcer. They only made about 200 of the 8mm guns, where they made about 4,000 of the 6.5mm guns. That 4,000 is a substantial number. This was not an insignificant pistol in the 1890s. Remember that this is now several iterations into the design, and these were coming on the market just at the same time as the C96 broom-handle Mausers. Now these are still blowback operated pistols. The cartridges are still relatively light. The 6.5mm cartridge was between a 65 and like an 82 grain bullet, traveling at between 725 and 775 feet per second. Several different loadings of this were manufactured by DWM. The 8mm cartridge is a little harder to nail down. It was an 8x22mm cartridge, and unfortunately, the later Bergman Simplex pistols also used an 8mm cartridge, and all the data that's out there appears to be for the Simplex. These 8mm 1896s were made in such small numbers that the cartridge loading data appears to have been lost, unfortunately. At any rate, it probably wasn't that much more potent than the 6.5mm, because of course it was still a blowback system and limited by that physically. Now, there were a number of different options you could get with these pistols. We have some of the standard ones here. You could get a nice cased example like these two. You could get them, by the way, in either a leather bound or leather covered or a solid wood case. You could get target versions like this with special precision sights and a long barrel and a set trigger. We'll take a close look at that in a minute. You could also get them with shoulder stocks if you wanted. In fact, what's kind of cool is you could order it from the factory with a shoulder stock installed, or if you changed your mind after you bought the pistol, you could actually go back to the factory and get a replacement unnumbered side plate that would allow you to mount a shoulder stock. So that's cool. We'll take a closer look at that stock as well in a moment. These still use the 5-round monkey tail type clips, although they did also make clips without the little curly Q tail if you preferred them that way. So we'll take a look at examples of those as well. So let's get right into it. Let's take a closer look at some of these very specific variants and examples. All right, so let's get started here with the number 3. This is the 6.5mm gun. As with the number 2s in 5mm, these were initially made without extractors and using ammunition that didn't have extractor grooves. That didn't last very long. Only a couple hundred of the early guns were made without extractors. And what's interesting about this is you can actually tell externally whether or not there is an extractor by looking at the grip. It may be, you can definitely tell, you can easily feel the difference, but even looking at them you can tell that this grip is a little bit bigger on the back and it's wider. The palm swells are larger. This top gun is a later one with an extractor. This bottom one with this grip style is an earlier gun that does not have an extractor. So that's how you can tell those two apart. The vast majority of them are later guns, only a few hundred, like I said, without extractors. Now, another difference that we have to be aware of is the difference between the number 3 and the number 4 pistols. They both use exactly the same frames. The differences are simply in the barrel, well, primarily in the barrel. The number 3 gun on top here is 6.5mm, and you'll notice that the barrel is slightly smaller in diameter than this gun, which is 8mm. Obviously requiring a slightly larger diameter barrel. Now there are two other ways you can differentiate between the 6.5 and the 8, the number 3 and the number 4. The first one, the most visible one, is the clip release at the bottom, so where the empty clips fall out when you chamber the last round. This is the 6.5, and you can see it has this center tang to it. This is the 8mm, which is completely open. And then the final difference between the two are these numbers engraved or stamped into the barrels. Now, as with the No.2 guns in 5mm, these numbers are actually a designation of bore diameter in terms of gauge. So this refers to the number of lead balls, the size of the bore that you can make out of 1 pound of lead. So for example, a 12 gauge shotgun means if you take a pound of lead and you separate it into 12 equally sized spheres, those spheres will be of the same diameter as a 12 gauge bore. Well, here, the 6.5mm gun is equivalent to 278 gauge. The 8mm gun is equivalent to 156 gauge. Now the 8mm also have this /14. Honestly, I don't know what that means. That indicates something. Not sure what it is. That sort of nomenclature is only found on the 8mm guns, not anywhere else. Now, while we're still looking at these two pistols, let's take a look at another thing that differs between them, and that is the manufacturer's stamp here on the back right side of the side plate, or on the side plate. There are two different versions, and they're pretty subtly different. One version has some lettering in it, one version does not. Now, these are some pretty subtle differences, but on this one you can see that there's no extra lettering. This is a picture of a little miner dude with a sunburst or a burst of light behind him. This marking indicates that the gun was actually made at Bergman's own factory in Gaggenau. Now, he made a lot of things, not just guns. He also manufactured automobiles, for example. And the majority of guns you see will not have this marking because he had to free up manufacturing space for the other projects he was engaged in. Remember, this wasn't a gun guy. This was really an industrialist. So what you'll find most of the time is this other marking. So this is the more common marking. You'll see the same miner and the same starburst or light burst behind him, but in this one there's lettering above and below saying Gaggenau VCS Suhl. This indicates that the gun was actually manufactured by a subcontractor, VC Schilling of Suhl. They manufactured the majority of these guns, as best I can tell. So looking at a few of the other markings on these pistols, right up on the front of the frame lug, you'll find the serial number. So this is a relatively early one, 1254. It is important to note that both the No.3s and the No.4s are made in the exact same serial number range, which actually makes it kind of impossible to know exactly how many of the No.4 guns were made, because you can't just find their serial number set. On the other side, you'll find that patent brevet SGDG, which in this case has been run through by a pin. Sometimes they have, sometimes they have not. Here's an example of one where the pin is not run through that patent marking. You will occasionally find them marked Pistolet Bergmann. Not really, I haven't been able to see enough examples to determine what that actually means. Someone may know, but not sure why they marked those on some and not on others. There is, however, one other really, I think, really cool feature to these that you'll find marked on the outside, and it's kind of like a connect the dots game. The disassembly order for the parts is actually marked on those parts themselves. So you'll notice this center pin holding this crosspiece in is marked No.1. That's the first part that you take off when you're disassembling the gun. This top dust cover piece is marked No.2. That's the second step of disassembling the gun. The crossbolt here is No.4. If we look at the back of the gun here, you'll see that the bolt itself is marked No.6. There are some more bits. The trigger is No.11. The hammer is marked No.10, although that's on the inside. The side plate here has got to be either No.8 or No.9, although I haven't found one that's actually marked that way. This barrel mounting screw is No.7. So as you can see, the disassembly order is scattered across the outside of the gun, which is, I think, just really kind of cool and clever. The safety is identical to that of the No.2. So this is the disengaged position. You flip it up and it's engaged. When it's engaged, it locks the trigger and it also locks the hammer. You can engage the safety whether the hammer's cocked or at rest. The safety does the same thing either way. And then this piece is just a tensioning spring to keep the safety in either position. Now let's take a look at this cased version. You can see all of the accoutrements that it comes with, your cleaning rod, your screwdriver, oil bottle, 2 of your clips of ammunition, the pistol, of course, and then what's interesting about this particular one, which is just a factory option that not actually, frankly, very few people took, was you could get a separate extra barrel. So how does one remove the barrel? Well, let's take a look. This screw is what locks the barrel in place, and the removable barrels you can identify by this square lug coming down off the back of the barrel. Now, when you have a detachable barrel like this, this indentation, this flute, is cut short to allow space for this. What you do to disassemble it is rotate this screw 90 degrees. The barrel then rotates counterclockwise up and can be pulled out. So you can see how this works. When you rotate the screw, it unlocks this a lug from this recess, then allows you to rotate the barrel out and pull it forward. So you could get an extra long barrel if you wanted one. Not all of the guns had this detachable barrel option. You can see there's still a screw here holding the barrel in place, but this one's not a quick detach barrel, and as a result, this flute comes in farther. There's a comparison between the two types. Mechanically, these are still straight, simple blowback pistols. You now have a dust cover over the operating mechanism and the workings of the gun. If we look in there, you can see this is an early one. It has no extractor on the bolt face, as compared to this later one, where if you look right at the top of the bolt, you'll see the extractor sitting there. Before we take a close look at this target model, let's take a look at the trigger mechanism in these guns. Loosen this screw, which has already been done, and then the side plate comes off the gun, and we have the trigger mechanism exposed. So this is a single action only trigger. Got the hammer back here, and you can see when I cock the hammer, this guy being pushed by this spring is going to snap into place, hold the hammer back under its sear notch right there. The spring for the hammer is actually under the grips. Then we have the trigger here. When you push the trigger back, this piece is going to push on this sear, which will rotate around this pivot point. This end goes that direction. This end up here goes forward, clears the sear notch, drops the hammer. At the same time, this piece is spring-loaded, so that as soon as it's pushed this enough to fire, it will actually snap down underneath the sear, acting as a semi-auto disconnector, so that holding the trigger back won't cause the gun to fire more than once. You can see that here. So as I start to push, that sear lifts up like that. When I push just far enough, this nose right down here is going to pop off the bottom, just like that. Hammer drops, and then when the gun cycles, the bolt will come back, push the hammer back to its cocked position. That is how the standard Bergman 1896 trigger works. So I mentioned that this trigger was standard with one exception. That exception is the target model gun. So this, of course, has the longer barrel. It's got specialized sights, really cool sights, by the way. We'll take a look at those in a moment. But it also has a totally different trigger mechanism. So let's take a look at that up close. So our hammer works basically the same way. When the hammer comes back, this little guy right here is going to pop in under spring pressure from this flat spring, and its nose hooks under the sear notch there, holds it in place. Now this is a very different trigger actuating thing. So what has to happen here, in order for this gun to be cocked, this piece has to hook onto that little hook. And that's actually not done by the bolt. You have to do that manually, and you do it by pushing up on this top piece of the trigger. So this is directly connected to this piece, and this all acts as one spring. So I push this back, you can kind of hear it pop, and now it hooks on there. When I pull the trigger, what's going to happen is I'm actually pushing this piece downward, this way. It will clear that hook. As soon as it does, this piece is under spring tension because it is one arm of a V-spring. As soon as it's cleared here, this pops up this direction. It's going to smack into the sear here, which will push it. It'll rotate around this central pivot. The sear notch clears and the hammer drops. So I'll put my wooden pointer stick there just to deaden the blow from the hammer. When I fire it, you can see it's going to go very quickly, but this is going to disconnect. This is under spring tension, and it's going to snap over, hit that, and fire, just like that. That is a really interesting and unusual trigger mechanism. So if you happen to be so lucky as to own one of these, you have to make sure the trigger's not going to work unless you manually recock it each time. Now the other interesting thing is we actually have a set screw here on the bottom of the trigger guard that adjusts the vertical position of this whole piece. So you can screw this in and out, which is going to adjust how much surface connects between these two hooks. And if, for example, you have this just slightly out of alignment, if it's too low, these two won't actually catch, and you won't be able to cock the trigger mechanism at all. By the way, if that happens, what you end up with is a hammer that's back, and you have no way to release it, short of taking off the side plate to see what's going on, or if you know what's going on, adjusting this screw so that it does work properly. All right, now that you've seen the special trigger, let's take a look at the other elements that went into the target gun. For one thing, this has a larger in diameter and octagonal barrel. Now, there were a few special order guns where you could get an octagonal chamber section right up here, but other than these special target models, the barrels on the Bergmans, the number 3s and 4s, were always fully round. With the target model, you're also going to get special, better target sights. Instead of just having a fixed V-notch on the back of the bolt, you're actually going to get a sight that's fixed on top of the frame here. It's a windage adjustable, and it's got this nice round notch insert. That goes along with this really fancy front sight. This front sight has an extremely thin front post, some nice protective wings around it, and a ball at the top of the post. When you put that into your rear notch, it lines up, fits in there just perfectly. Makes actually for a very nice sight. You can see we've got a windage screw right there on the left side for easy windage adjustment. Lastly, of course, you get the extra second finger loop. That doesn't do anything functional. It doesn't move. It's not a mechanical part. It just gives you a place to rest your second finger, which was kind of the style at the time. Not something I would bother with today. Now, if you wanted to be able to shoot your Bergman more accurately, but you didn't want to deal with the big, heavy, long barrel and the fancy extra sights, you could instead opt to get a shoulder stock. So like many of the shoulder stocks of this period, this actually does open up and act as a holster as well. So I'm not going to do that because it's a fragile piece. It's currently packed with paper just so it maintains its shape. It's interesting that the hardware of this is not steel. It's actually made out of zinc. And kind of like the occasional rare Luger with zinc elements, it's pretty fragile and kind of crumbly even. So if you happen to have one of these, do be very careful with it. I definitely would not recommend shooting with one of these things. They're just too scarce and too rare and too fragile today. Now, the stock attachment method is interesting and rather different. We have a button on this side. Push that button, and you retract the little locking lug on the front of the stock, right there. This whole piece slides into this hollow round lug located on the side plate of the pistol. And once it's all the way in, this hook secures it in place. So this goes in like that. This one doesn't want to go quite far enough for that hook to engage, but you get the idea there. And then you have a nice shoulder stock. Now, as I mentioned, you could order this as an option from the factory, or you could actually buy a replacement side plate. The only thing holding this on is just this one screw. And you could get a replacement side plate with this stock lug, so you could retrofit an existing gun with a shoulder stock mount. Now, for a left-hander, this is a little awkward, because of course it sits on the right side of the gun where your thumb would need to be. But if you're right-handed, as of course the majority of people are, you can actually get a pretty comfortable grip on this pistol. You can get that modern tactical thumb on the safety thing, finger in the trigger well, and actually get a cheek weld on this, and it's actually not bad. Now, these Bergman pistols were sold overseas as well, and if you ran a company, an import company, they'd be happy to mark them with your company name. And the British in particular were somewhat active in importing and selling these Bergmans. You can see this one here was ordered and resold by the Wesley Richards Company. So they've put their markings on the top, Wesley Richards and Company, London. Pretty cool. And the one last iterative detail I want to mention on these pistols is the front sight. There were 3 different versions of it. This being the very earliest, you can see that the front sight is one completely integral piece with the barrel. Now, that was probably fairly expensive, so they replaced that fairly early on with this. Now, you have to look very carefully. This actually has a separate dovetailed piece for the front sight, but it's been contoured nice and smooth, so it looks like one fixed bit. And that is not intended to be windage adjustable. That was also changed to the final version, which is probably most common, which is a definitively windage adjustable version. You can see that this dovetail sticks out on both sides, and it's definitely, you know, it overhangs, and it's there so that you can windage zero the gun, where this one is not intended to be. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. We have this really cool selection here of Bergmann No.3 and No.4 pistols. Very, very uncommon to find this many of them all in one place. And I think we pretty well have every variation of these represented here. So if you enjoy this sort of content, please consider checking out my Patreon page. It is funding from folks like you. It makes it possible for me to travel about and find these guns in these collections and put them on video for you guys. So thank you very much for watching. All right, guys, we have one little addendum here, and that is this oddball gun that just kind of doesn't fit. Now, it's unusual because, for a couple of reasons. But first off, if you look at the typical Bergmans, they've got these two slots, like viewing slots, so you can see if the gun's loaded on the side of the magazine well. This guy doesn't. However, it does have them on the opposite side. This is pretty much the only gun known to exist that has these features backwards like that. Now, in other ways, it's identical to a standard Bergmann No.3 in 6.5 millimeter, with the exception of this engraving on the magazine cover. That is VCHR for Christopher Schilling. So V. Christopher Schilling, Suhl, made in Germany. And this clearly was some sort of presentation piece because of that engraving combined with the machining difference of those viewing slots. And it doesn't have, for example, the typical Gaggenau logo here on the side plate. I have no idea where exactly this gun was intended to go. I'm sure this one had an interesting history, but it's a history that has been lost at this point. So who knows? It's a very interesting example. So thanks for watching through a little past the end credits. Hope you guys enjoyed it.